Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest this week is Julius Krein. He is the founder and editor of the American Affairs Journal. Julius, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, appreciate you being here. I've been going down the rabbit hole of your thinking and listening to a whole bunch of your podcast appearances, which have been super fascinating. And I'm excited to kind of dive into and get into the meat of this conversation. I thought maybe a good place to start, just because I think a lot of our listeners might not know a lot about American Affairs, but it's an incredible publication. I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So American Affairs is a quarterly policy journal published in print and online, of course. I and a few others started it back in 2017, really in response to what I considered then and still consider now major changes that were happening in both political economy and geopolitics, sort of the end of history and the end of the kind of neoliberal consensus that was really beginning to manifest then and became very apparent when Donald Trump rose to prominence and won the election in 2016. And it really began as a forum for voices from all over the place across the political spectrum to begin offering new perspectives, new approaches, hopefully new policy solutions to the set of challenges that we were facing then, and which were very different from the way that conventional politics was sort of aligned in the conventional political debates of the previous 20, 30 years. And American Affairs was an attempt to sort of look at politics on these new dimensions in ways that didn't necessarily map onto old conventional debates, and hopefully push the frontiers of policy thinking and larger questions that were not being done in conventional political journals and policy debates at the time. I would say, it's been an interesting journey the last few years. What began as I'd say, a kind of a cross-partisan populist effort in 2016, a lot of that stuff has now migrated into what I think you could consider the political mainstream. So we've really been able to work with people from all over the map, from Trump and Sanders to the Biden administration to Republicans and Democrats in both houses of Congress.
Fascinating. So, as you think about the sort of trajectory of American Affairs, you guys were sort of early, at least in my view, you were early to the big change happening in American politics. Are you seeing anything similar to that happening now? Like, are people settling into this idea that we're just going to challenge globalization and that's the new normal, or is there anything new on the horizon?
Well, I think both can be true. On the one hand, yes, people have settled in. Debates that were, scarcely even possible before, the word industrial policy, for example, could not really be mentioned in polite company in 2015 or whatever, questioning issues around China and trade with China. Those were sort of very seemingly fringe issues back then. That is not the case today. And there are a number of issues like that. On the other hand, I think there are still many, many problems where we don't really have solutions. A lot of the ferment in intellectual debates hasn't necessarily translated into actual policy change. The culture wars have shifted, but they're still very intense, still happening. So I think it's both. On the one hand, yes, we've settled in the 2024 election feels very different to me than the 2016 election. On the other hand, there's still a lot of issues where we're very far from any kind of new consensus, much less the concrete policy changes you would need, in my opinion, to address these problems.
Yeah, it strikes me that not only do we not have a consensus, but there doesn't appear to be any political leader on the national stage today who's articulating even a vision that could become a consensus. Like, everyone is sort of talking past each other or not even addressing the issue. And I feel like that might be sort of the biggest problem in politics today, is sort of the lack of a coherent vision for people to rally around. But what do you think about that?
Yes, I think that's true. I think, it's a big question. I mean, on the one hand, um, it's one thing to say that, we lack a politician that's expressing his vision. I'm inclined to sort of look at kind of why is that and what are deeper sources of those issues. I think on the one hand, you have to look at, is there actually a kind of consensus sense of what the American people are, what the country is, what its direction is. Part of our politics, our politics has changed a lot since the 20th century. I think we're used to thinking in politics in these kind of not necessarily schoolhouse rock terms, but very simplistic notion that ideas come up and they get published, and then the world kind of absorbs them, and you forge a consensus and so on. I'm not sure that's really how politics works today. It tends to be very donor driven by a fairly narrow group of very large donors and NGOs that are pushing certain agendas and are not necessarily connected to the larger population that you would have had back in the early 20th century, whatever, where you had these broad social movements and they were kind of federalist in orientation, where you had local groups and state groups and national groups, and people who did not necessarily have access to billionaire funding were able to kind of organize and advance an agenda at multiple levels of government. In many cases, that really doesn't exist today. If you don't have a sort of billionaire backer or an NGO behind you, a lot of the stuff just gets lost. So I think there's some deep disconnects there that prevent the sort of national leader you're talking about from emerging. We shouldn't, when we've had these in the past, whether it was Roosevelt or others, they tended to represent very deep social groups that had been around and had been politically organizing for decades. In a lot of ways, that really isn't there. And then if you look at the corporate side, our politics is very fractured between a kind of cable news, social media, entertainment spectacle on the one hand, and the actual policy movements driven by corporate lobbies, which tend to be sort of very narrow, specific, in the weeds, detailed stuff that nobody really pays attention to, even if it can have very significant implications. And so that fracturing is it makes it very difficult for that kind of broad consensus leader to sort of emerge, much less to kind of push a larger and sort of seemingly different unifying agenda.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I had Nick Troiano, who's leading this really interesting sort of civic body attempting to do primary reform. Are you familiar with Unite America?
I'm not familiar with that specific organization.
Okay, so basically what Unite America is trying to do is fund ballot initiatives in states who are interested in pursuing certain kind of primary reform, essentially ending the closed primary system in the states that still have it. But even they, right, like they're sort of a pro-democracy reform entity. Even they are reliant on this channel of money that you reference, this billionaire funding channel or corporate funding channel, because they got money from some Silicon Valley entrepreneurs basically to start and to fund their first successful campaign. They were the group that was partially responsible for that reform in Alaska. So you're right that this sort of like this money thing is something we can't ignore. Is there any policy solution that would actually fix that problem?
I don't think there's any single policy solution. I mean, I think things like opening up primaries would probably help, but you really need a larger shift among how everybody, but particularly kind of large donors and very wealthy participate in politics. We have this very perverse dynamic where politics is sort of seen as this thing where kind of a bunch of crazy people go yell at each other on TV. And some people throw themselves into that and enjoy that entertainment spectacle. But then, the other focus of politics is basically, you want a really specific thing that's in your self-interest, a certain tax credit or regulatory reform or whatever. And that's where the sort of corporate lobbies are. And then you have, kind of the larger donors who tend to just be sort of dilettantes, in my opinion, and are in it for either a kind of moral validation or they have this certain idea that they kind of like. It feels good to them for the moment, and they fund these little groups for a while. But they're not, the two sides are not being connected. the idea that we have to think about kind of the larger structure of our economy, the larger structure of our politics when we look at policy, and not just be pushing for this or that tax credit. And it's, what happens is that, I don't know, what you might call normal or stable and balanced individuals tend to just exit the scene entirely because it's also stupid. And that just accelerates the problem, because the only people are in it are, often somewhat psychologically damaged people that have these very narrow agendas that they want to push, and these real kind of partisan fanatics or ideological fanatics. And I think, all the primary stuff is good. It's probably helpful. But until we really start to see a renewed sense of kind of national responsibility, national purpose among kind of the people at the top of our society, it's hard for me to imagine that, a whole lot will actually change for the better, even with a few tweaks to the primary process or what have you.
Yeah. That's a topic actually I've been covering at length in my newsletter, and also with many of the guests who've come on this show. We've had a bunch of sort of civic activists and whatnot, and leaders of various in various fields. And the topic of the sort of bear market and civic engagement just keeps coming up. And I've seen it firsthand here. I live in Los Angeles, an area that has incredible power and wealth, and yet can't solve, some real serious problems. And part of the reason it can't solve these problems is that the elites in particular, not just the wealthy elites, but all the elites are relatively disengaged from the
Yep.
political processes, especially the local ones. And so there's no one in the ear of the city council or the mayor or the county board of supervisors, or they're not in the ear long enough to actually get anything done. Nor are they contributing to, their communities in other ways, like through nonprofit work or whatever. And it's a huge problem, and something that I feel like more and more people are talking about. And maybe I'm optimistic about it, but what do you think? Are you seeing anything that would make you feel like, hey, maybe the bear market and civic virtue is coming to an end?
Yes and no. I mean, I think, as you said, more people are talking about it, um, but they're they're fundamentally trapped in the system. I mean, not people talking about it doesn't necessarily lead to things getting done. And as you said, there's not the sort of large donor class doesn't necessarily feel the problems with kind of basic competence in the cities. I mean, they don't necessarily care if the public schools are a disaster, or if, the transit system is decrepit, things like that. And so you tend not to get the level of engagement that you get on kind of niche culture war concerns that really interest them for one reason or another. And if I had the answer to sort of solving that problem, obviously, we'd go and do it, and it would all be great. But I don't, obviously, and I wonder. There has been this. I think, the kind of Reagan turn, neoliberal turn, whatever you want to call it. This notion that, if you just pursue your self interest aggressively enough, everything will work itself out. I'm not critical of business. Business is very important, but I think to some extent that attitude has gone vastly too far, and it prevents any kind of real collective sense of responsibility that I think American elites used to exhibit.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I feel like we have created a culture that is absolutely obsessed with the self-interested pursuit of success or wealth or whatever. And our children are being sort of shepherded along the way. They're being bombarded with messages that are essentially like, hey, the point of life is to go out and do whatever you want to do for yourself. And there's
Yep.
really no reference to a greater responsibility. But unfortunately, we live in a democracy. And so those two narratives, they're not really consistent with each other, because you can't ignore these responsibilities. It's got to be done, or it'll just be done really badly, or it'll be done in a worst case by the absolute worst type of people. And then you could get into a situation where democracy turns into something else, which is what has happened in other countries at other times in history. And it feels like we're headed towards some kind of moment of awakening, whether we want it or not. Like, hey, Americans are going to have to wake up and accept the responsibilities of citizenship, or there's going to be consequences. I don't know how close we are, but it feels that way.
Well, I think in the past, a lot of this has tended to be driven by sort of great power competition. And a lot of the things that, we kind of look back to now, probably somewhat idealistically and fantastically, that was, in the mid-century, in the golden age or whatever, that was driven by, in many ways, competition with the Soviet Union. And this notion that if you didn't, if things really went off the rails here and we didn't take care of certain things, then the country would turn communist. That was a real threat for a while, or at least, communism would make advances around the world. That was a very strong threat. And I think when you lost that in the end of history, all of a sudden that kind of pressure toward greater civic engagement, sort of deeper sense of political responsibility, a lot of that disappeared. And I think if one wanted to be optimistic, you could say with the reemergence of great power competition, specifically vis-a-vis China, that these sort of things can't be taken for granted anymore. And that may be driving some of the renewed discussions on these topics. But I don't think that's a guarantee. I mean, I think there's, the China challenge is very different because the economies are so integrated, and a lot of people have made their money precisely through this globalization model and essentially through the things that have allowed China to become a great power competitor. So I don't know exactly which way it goes, but I do think the prospect of great power competition does open up some new possibilities in domestic politics as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Historically, that's sort of how it happens. It's either some kind of like great internal moral conflict, like the Civil War, or you're competing against somebody else. Well, before we get in, you have some fascinating ideas around the political economy landscape. But before we get into that, I want to ask you about one thing that you've mentioned on several other podcasts, but never sort of got into. But I'm super fascinated here, which is that you spent some time doing economic development work in Afghanistan. And I'm fascinated by it because for many reasons, but one is I had seen this documentary Restrepo. Did you see that movie?
I haven't seen that one.
Okay, really, really kind of sad but fascinating documentary. And there's a scene in Restrepo where these well-intentioned young military officers are sitting in like a cave with some Afghanistan, citizens of Afghanistan, and talking to them about why they have to work together to produce jobs. And the people, the Afghanis, were just looking at them like, "What are you talking about? Like jobs?" Like you could tell that there wasn't even like the first thought in their mind ever that they wanted to create an economy that had jobs like America. That's the feeling I got watching that scene. So, what was your experience?
Yes, well, my experience is very educational, but not in a good way, because what I saw was incredible incompetence. And I should, I was basically a subcontractor with a Defense Department thing called the the Task Force for Business Stability Operations, which is about as effective as it sounds. But basically, yes, the goal was to go and help grow the Afghan economy to support the new political system or whatever. But essentially, what it was is a few companies like IBM and Google basically got these contracts. It was all sort of driven, I think, by optics in DC. So they went and built this, they called it an ICT incubator. I don't know if anybody uses those letters anymore, but Information and Communications Technology Incubator in Herat, Afghanistan. This is a place with, a very low literacy rate. They had to buy internet from Iran at an exorbitant cost. And, there was, you might have been able to build some like light manufacturing or other things that sort of existed in the local economy. But you're not setting up software companies. So they were, in some cases, these companies would be selling to the U.S. government services. In other cases, they were like the children of the local warlords who would like take the contract and then subcontract it to India, stuff like that. It was all a bit of a joke. And there were so many stories of failure of our development efforts. They wanted them to grow crops other than opium. But first they gave them a crop that had like a complementary growing season. Then they gave them like potatoes. Nobody's ever grown potatoes in Afghanistan. They had potato beetles, so they paid people to like bring in a potato beetle. So then they just started farming potato beetles. They finally got the potatoes harvested. They didn't have anywhere to store them. They all rotted. They went to one village, they thought the price of eggs was too high or something. They gave everybody, a chicken. And then everybody had eggs, so nobody bought eggs. All the egg suppliers went out of business. And then the festival day came, everybody slaughtered their chickens, then nobody had any eggs. They built a slaughterhouse that was, larger than any slaughterhouse and, could have had massive overcapacity. But that wasn't even the worst part of it, because the Italians had built the same thing about a mile down the road, and I guess nobody checked. The whole thing was a sort of stimulus program for Northern Virginia. It was poorly managed, terribly run, and it really had no success stories that I'm actually aware of. And that was my first, I would say my radicalizing moment or political awakening, that none of this stuff was really being done with any sort of real public purpose in mind. And, it sort of made me think that, we were not turning Afghanistan into America, but America might have been turning into Afghanistan in various ways.
Wow. That's an incredible story. How long were you in Afghanistan doing this?
I actually was in Afghanistan for about a month, and I was working on the project for maybe a year.
A year. And these contracts that you mentioned sort of at the beginning there from Google and IBM, are these like hundreds of millions of dollars? Are these like massive
I
contracts?
don't remember the exact size of it. There actually was an inspector general's report on this thing
Mm-hmm.
that was pretty damning. But again, on a lot of these issues that are not kind of immediately part of the domestic culture war, they tend not to get a lot of attention.
Yeah. And do you think, looking back on that experience, do you think that the incompetence that you saw in that effort was a function of a broader sort of system wide degree of incompetence, or just because it was in a far corner of the earth and people were focused on the war and other things instead of that?
I mean, it was definitely system wide. I mean, because the contracts are assigned in this kind of very obscure way, and there's all kinds of these weird consultants who have their hand in it, and it's basically, it's not, I think the kind of underlying impetus of the program sort of made sense. You have to, if you're going to if we're going to launch this massive experiment in Afghanistan, then building up the economy makes sense. But nobody sort of had any real skin in the game. And so what it came down to was, all right, you get a prestigious company in there that wants to do a photo op. That's exciting. That's a way to advance your career in DC, as opposed to actually, talking to people on the ground and doing something useful. I would say there's another problem in kind of U.S. foreign affairs generally, that we tend to send people to these countries. The youngest people, the least experienced people, go to the most problematic countries because once you're a senior, career official, you want to go to the embassy in Paris where it's nice and there's nothing to do. So you get the younger people going to these places. They're there for 12, 14 months. They don't have any ability to build up local relationships. They don't know what's going on. And they're often not really even allowed to leave like the embassy or the bases. Americans, I saw this, relative to other countries and how they operated in both Afghanistan and Africa. We tend to be extremely security conscious. And so basically, I mean, as who was not officially part of the government, had much more freedom to travel around and talk to people, though it wasn't that much. But a lot of the actual official government people, they never leave the base. They don't talk to anybody aside from the people that actually approach them and want to do business with them. And there's many things written about the disaster that was Afghanistan. There's a book called No Good Men Among the Living. But I think from the beginning that conflict was severely flawed, and our approach to the sociology there, our approach to sort of who would potentially replace the Taliban or whether the Taliban could be replaced, that was driven by kind of domestic U.S. political concerns rather than any recognition of reality.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting to hear you describe that because I had a good friend of mine on the podcast just recently, and he was in the Peace Corps in Nicaragua for 2.5 years. And the way he described his experience was the complete opposite. He was immersed in the community. There was no regard for his security. It was, doing the work and interfacing with the people. It's amazing to me that, I understand why we want to have security. These are dangerous places, especially some place like Afghanistan. But how can you really change a country without engaging with the people? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and it may be true for the Peace Corps and things like that. But for DoD, high level DoD officials, whatever, they're not really seeing much. And I mean, and I remember going. I went to it was the consulate in Iraqi Kurdistan, and I remember asking them about questions around the economy and things like that, and they were sort of like, why would anyone ever want to do business in Kurdistan? Apparently oblivious to the fact that there's oil there and there's massive international companies already in Kurdistan, but they were only there for a few months, and it didn't really matter. So
Yeah, crazy. Well, thanks for answering that. I'm glad I asked you because I learned something and it was super interesting. The what I really wanted to get into in this conversation is you've been talking for years now, very eloquently about an idea, a sort of high level thesis around our political economy, and I love that you're using that phrase. I feel like I've written several articles from my newsletter about the phrase political economy because I feel like people have forgot that they aren't really separate. The whole science of economics started off as with this idea that it is a connected system between government and private enterprise. So I love that you're using that term, but I'd love to just maybe start with can you kind of summarize your point of view around the challenge to the neoliberal order and what that means?
I'll do my best. I think we tend to take sort of neoliberalism as at its word and associate it with a kind of simplistic kind of more freedom, less government, more market, that sort of thing. And there's some ways in which that's true. But what really happened, from the 70s to the 2000s, it wasn't simply cutting taxes and deregulation. That was maybe the least important part of it. What we really saw was a shift in the sectoral emphasis of the U.S. economy. Um, and a lot of this arose because the old sort of what is called in the academic literature the Fordist economy, that mid-century, GE, GM, Ford, big integrated manufacturers, all that. That all started to become uncompetitive as basically the world rebuilt after World War II. And all of a sudden you had European competitors and Japanese competitors, and they were cheaper, and they also were doing their own kind of tariffs and industrial policies. And anyway, there was a 1971 report for the Nixon White House that basically said, U.S. economic dominance is gone. And a lot of this can be found in a book by Gary Gersel called The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, which I think is a good summary of this stuff. But anyway, what happened, the U.S. response to that, it could have gone maybe one of two ways. One was a really concerted effort to sort of protect and strengthen and rebuild the U.S. manufacturing position. That would have been very problematic from a foreign relations perspective, Cold War perspective, because you would have had to take a lot of measures against Cold War allies. And so what effectively happened is what we call neoliberalism, but really it was a shift in the way that you would make money in the U.S. basically. And instead of an economy centered around these big integrated manufacturers, you would have an economy centered around intellectual property and financial rents. So today you look at the most profitable companies, whether it's Apple or Microsoft or Nvidia, big tech companies like that, or kind of big finance institutions, the capital intensive parts of the value chain, the manufacturing, the labor intensive parts, away from where their actual profits are made, which is on the intellectual property. And U.S. policy was part of this all the way. I mean, you can, when you talk about trade, people talk about how we have liberalized around protection for domestic manufacturers, cutting tariffs and all that. All that's true. But at the same time, we actually undertook pretty significant efforts to protect intellectual property. That was WTO TRIPS and things like financial rents, things like ISDS. And you saw a lot of it also with kind of antitrust and patent reforms. Again, people focus on kind of horizontal antitrust was kind of like, this company's too big and it's hurting competition among peers. But there was also this move which basically allowed companies to exert greater and greater control across their supply chains without actually having to manufacture the product. So, Apple can control pricing of the iPhone, marketing, all kinds of things. It can impose a lot of restrictions on how its suppliers treat their workers and things like that. But it doesn't actually have to pay for the manufacturing of the iPhone. That probably would not have been possible in 1960. So anyway, the combination of this shift toward a kind of capital light model, intellectual property and financial rent model, it is obviously very successful financially. Stock market valuations are high, capital gains are good, things like that. But we're sort of living with the problems of that now, which is if you just lose the capital intensive parts of your economy, many of those are the most strategically important, whether that's the defense industrial base, other critical supply chains. We're sort of living with those problems now. And in addition to that, you've cut off the most of the profits from most of the labor force. So that obviously feeds into these issues around, inequality and dead end jobs or whatever. That we're obviously accelerating, from 2000 to very recent years.
Yeah, that's a great summary, by the way. A couple follow-ups. If you were to rewind the clock, you mentioned something about this sort of implications of the Cold War. In the 70s, when it became apparent that, our competitive advantage had maybe dissipated or gone away, was the option essentially to introduce tariffs at that moment in time to try to save our manufacturing, and we opted not to do that? Was on the table? Or was it something else?
I tend not to engage in these kind of counterfactuals because I don't know that they mean anything. But I mean, it's interesting if you look, the time to do tariffs is when you have an actual industry to protect. Once you've lost that industry, tariffs, I think, are less effective. But like Reagan, for instance, and actually I think this may even go back to Lyndon Johnson, but Reagan did it too, where they imposed tariffs and voluntary export agreements on like light trucks and certain parts of automotives, and the U.S. still does well in those sectors. And the area where we didn't impose tariffs, that auto manufacturing basically been lost. There's very little American manufacturing of sedans or whatever today. So there is a case to be made that it may very well have worked, but we obviously didn't choose that path. I think the U.S. after World War II basically thought that U.S. manufacturing dominance would just always exist, and we didn't really have to think about it. And so when we built like the innovation system, the scientific research system, pretty much all the focus went to universities, and we basically let big corporate labs like Bell Labs, RCA Labs, all those which made huge scientific contributions. We let them all kind of disappear because financial investors didn't want them. It seemed like a waste of money. And as I said, a lot of the capital intensive parts of the economy, they have low valuations. They tend to be very unattractive to investors, but they're very strategic. And I think those two blind spots meant that we would inevitably lose our industrial base. So I don't know, tariffs in 1970s, or I think the Plaza Accord that Reagan did was actually very interesting. Those helped, and maybe you could have done more of that without kind of upending the Cold War alliance or whatever. I don't know, but certainly the fact that we basically just ignored, basically allowed capital-intensive parts of the economy to be surrendered without thinking through the strategic ramifications of that was a huge error. And I think there was a Chinese official the other, maybe it was a couple of weeks ago, said something like the U.S., losing most of its manufacturing base was a strategic error, and we don't actually even have to worry about competing with them anymore, which I think is representative of kind of what happens when you do this.
Yeah, and we're attempting to revitalize it with like the CHIPS Act and trying to incentivize these companies to bring back semiconductor manufacturing to this country. Do you think that's good policy in this moment in time?
I think it's directionally correct. I'm not sure that these specific measures will work, or I think they'll work in the sense we're going to have more chip foundries than we otherwise would have. Will these fundamentally change the dynamics around investment in that sector? I don't think so. Will the U.S. become a leader in chip manufacturing? I do not think so. I think that we're still missing kind of core aspects of industrial policy. One in particular, we're not really addressing some of the fundamental financial incentives that I mentioned earlier. We're not really doing anything around kind of the profit strategy of profiting off intellectual property without actually having to build it or invest in the production. And we've also, for whatever reason, Americans, they think of industrial policy simply as subsidize a sector. But the successful cases of industrial policy, if you look at Asia or Israel or places like that, they tend to build in kind of conditions around improving performance. So, on chips, for example, you say like, all right, if you can produce 7 nanometer, then you make it to the next stage and we'll give you more money to go after 5 and after 3. Industrial policy is not a jobs program. It should not be a, incumbent bailout scheme for Intel or whatever. It should really be about driving improvements in production, improvements in the sector, making your sector at least world leading or more competitive. And I think in a lot of those cases that's forgotten. And whether you use kind of market competition to do that or kind of government set milestones and national champions or whatever, I think we're not doing that. Certainly not enough, and in many cases not at all. And I unfortunately I think that bodes poorly for the industrial policy measures we've passed. The other part of it is I think there's kind of 2 ways to do this. One is you either set up kind of a quasi-independent agency like the Fed to sort of manage this. In Israel, that was the Office of the Chief Scientist. In Japan, it was MITI. Or you can do it like we do with the Farm Bill here in the U.S., which is actually a fairly, you can disagree with some of the goals or whatever, but, American agriculture is very productive. It's very successful. But there you have a 5-year reauthorization that has to get done. And so you have this opportunity to kind of assess what's going on, update the program, et cetera, et cetera. And what we did with, CHIPS and IRA is essentially these big bills. They took, 3 years to pass. They're loaded with everybody's hopes and dreams. And there's not really an evaluation mechanism or an update mechanism. And that's not a good recipe, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned the sort of incentive structure, and you've talked eloquently about this as well. This sort of phenomenon, like I got my iPhone here, and I forget their tagline, but it's like designed in America,
California, made in China. Yeah,
made in China. There you go. So that's a perfect, actually, summary of whatever 30, 40 years of this policy playing out. And my understanding, just from listening to you and reading some of your stuff, is that one of the implications of this is that, or maybe a cause and an implication, is that we've got a stock market that's kind of got the wrong incentive in it, where for many reasons, companies have been rewarded for engaging in this activity and in lieu of making on the ground investments in these capital intensive industries. But can you talk about that and talk about like whether there's a way to reverse that in your opinion?
Yeah, I might articulate it somewhat differently. I mean, if the way I would say it is the stock market performance and valuations tend to have very little to do with underlying national economic growth or productivity growth or other factors that we would consider kind of good for the economy as a whole or the country. And I think that's sort of built into the nature of finance. But the role of policy is to try to kind of change the incentives to bring them together so that they're more aligned. And I don't dispute, for example, that if Apple all of a sudden announced that they're going into manufacturing, their multiple would just collapse. So it's not they're operating entirely rationally. But I think if that's where policy has to step in, and whether through some combination of carrots and sticks and subsidies or trade restrictions or whatever, needs to ensure that the activities that we want are actually profitable and incentivized for investors and entrepreneurs.
Right. But there's another issue here too that's important to know, which is like we have a system where the leaders of these multinational companies have been rewarded for doing things like not giving out dividends or not making those capital investments and engaging in outsourcing instead and doing a share buyback program. And then you've got this, massive bonus tied to your stock performance that you're sort of financial engineering. And those two phenomena seem related to me, but what do you think?
Yeah, well, that's another point about how, the neoliberal consensus wasn't really about freedom, because I think, if China wasn't subsidizing their factories massively, they would have been less attractive. And so people are like, well, if we just had true free trade and everybody followed the rules, wouldn't that be great? But that's not actually what people wanted, because, Apple would make a lot less money if that were the case, or they would have, 10, 20 years ago, whatever. So, the neoliberal model kind of relies on this kind of state support. It's just not your state, and it's ultimately harmful to you. I think, yeah, at some level we need, and I don't think it's really happened yet. I don't think the business community is really willing to look at the long-term implications of that, and how, even if reshoring production or increasing investment in these strategic sectors is short-term harmful for you as an investor in the immediate term, that the whole underlying system is going to collapse if that doesn't happen. Because ultimately all this stuff relies upon essentially U.S. geopolitical dominance and U.S. stewardship of the global economy and the global military order. And we're in a situation now where that's increasingly tenuous. I mean, it's going to take us 7 years, I think, to replace the ammunition that we spent in Ukraine. And we're not even, directly involved in that conflict. There was a report from a pretty reputable think tank, CSIS, Center for Strategic International Studies, that shows that if China were to make a move for Taiwan, the U.S. would be out of ammunition in like 7 days. We can't really beat the Houthis. We can't really control the Middle East anymore. All this stuff is starting to fray. And when that happens, I think a lot of these corporate networks and the way that you made money they're not going to work anymore. And in the long term, it's going to be very damaging. And even at more prosaic levels, the U.S. can't really make generic drugs. If you have a supply problem, pretty soon we can't do surgeries, stuff like that. So I think that's really the imbalance in the system, that the conditions that the neoliberal order relies on, whether it's for corporate profits or the stability of the international order, whatever you want to call it, those are being eroded. They're being eroded by precisely the profit strategies that this model unleashed. And I think that's the fundamental crisis that we're only starting to see. And it's a question of, are we going to do something before it's too late? Because China is the largest trade partner with most of the world now, and I think probably China doesn't really want to take on this role, but if they wanted to really disrupt things, they could do it. And I don't know that the U.S. could kind of protect the liberal order in the way that it assumes anymore.
Yeah. And it's interesting and scary, actually, in a way to think about, because it's true, right? If you're the CEO of Apple or something, your entire stock valuation is sort of predicated upon the idea that America can defend the global order. And it sounds like that's not necessarily a great assumption. I mean, if we can't produce ammunition, or if it's going to take us that long to replace the ammunition that we spent in not even a war that we're fighting, that really puts it into context about what we can and can't do in terms of projecting our power in the world. Do you think, zooming back out to the war on terror, do you think America won the war on terror?
No, I think it's actually pretty amazing. I think if you go and look at Osama bin Laden's like early video speeches when this was launched, I think you have to say that Osama bin Laden won, because coming out, we basically allowed the complete deterioration of our defense industrial base. It created massive internal conflict, the loss of trust in U.S. institutions. I think, if it didn't necessarily begin with it, it was certainly accelerated by all the stuff that happened around the Iraq War and things like that. And the U.S. is a vastly, vastly weaker country than before the war on terror started. I think you have to. It brings me no pleasure at all to say it, but I think you have to say that Osama bin Laden strategically won the war on terror.
And is that a function more of our mistakes than sort of his, the terrorist activity? It sounds like
Yeah,
it.
it's totally our mistakes. I mean, and I think the approaching this conflict from the perspective of trying to promote democracy everywhere, this kind of moralistic approach to it, and I think what he really did. We may have noticed these problems earlier if we were not in the process. It's. I was at a defense conference the other day. In the 2000 Quadrennial Review, the Pentagon announced that the U.S. faced no threats, essentially. And this notion that, there were no great power threats anymore. The only thing we really had to worry about was like IEDs and terrorism. And that went on for, decades, really. And the shift in defense innovation and what kind of technologies we were looking at, and the idea that we might have to, produce artillery shells in very large quantities, that was never going to happen in Afghanistan, but obviously it matters a lot in Ukraine. So there's no question that we were sort of completely blown off course by that. And, who knows, but it certainly didn't help in recognizing these problems earlier.
Yeah. Do you think, bringing it back to today, do you think that Israel is making same kinds of mistakes in Gaza based on what we know today that we made in sort of our attempt to deal with terrorism?
I have no idea. It's a fundamentally different situation. But I think in general, the U.S. needs to focus on the great power conflict that's now in front of us and the underlying industrial base and economic issues that are our greatest sources of weakness. I think there's a possibility that the Gaza thing spirals into a kind of larger Middle Eastern regional conflict. There's certainly a case that there's kind of a block emerging of China, Russia, and Iran and its proxies. And if they all decided to kind of move at once, it's not clear to me that the U.S. could handle that and its allies could handle that. But I have no opinions really on kind of tactics or what Israel is doing on Gaza. I have no expertise there, and I'm not sure that it's really a U.S. interest.
Yeah. I only ask because in thinking about the war on terror, I've had several former military members now on the podcast, and only two, but both of them suggested, pretty strongly suggested that from their perspective, the problem with the war on terror is that we compromised our values in pursuing it and to try to win. And so we engaged in activities that compromised our sort of position morally in the world. And you could argue that, invading Iraq is a good example of that. But there's all the actions that happened inside of Iraq too. The Abu Ghraib stuff, and I don't know. I don't have any on the ground intel in about Gaza, but I'm just curious. If similar things are happening.
I mean, it's interesting how much of politics is basically the different partisan parties regretting what they did 20, 30 years ago. So, I mean, the Republican Party under Trump is now, sees the deep state as an enemy. A lot of that was created in the war on terror. And I think, on the left, there was this kind of reflexive anti-American approach to things. And now they're all champions for the liberal international order and actually the military and these sort of security agencies. And so, clearly the war on terror did sort of decenter the U.S. and knock it off balance, not only in the kind of hard military production aspect, but in our own kind of cultural debates. And I don't know enough about Israel to say whether that's happening there, but I think we clearly have not fully recovered from it here.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you. I want to turn now to try to end this with some optimism and ideas for the future. So, what when you think about this challenge, this reindustrialization challenge, and the policies that get like, what is it going to take? What should we be doing? What should we be focused on in America?
I think again the main thing is we need to make the one thing we haven't been able to financially engineer is making it attractive to invest in capital intensive strategic sectors. So there's several proposals around that. I mean, things like defense procurement reform and other better use of contracting throughout the government. Things called like advanced contracting, demand pull measures, milestone payments. I mean, if you look at something like SpaceX, and it's interesting that both of Elon Musk's Tesla and SpaceX are kind of extraordinary examples of successful U.S. industrial policies, even though both sides now hate each other, which is sad. But SpaceX, NASA basically introduced these kind of milestone contracts to allow a company that was not a defense incumbent, did not have government contracts before, to compete for these things and outperform others and win them. And basically, again, it's sort of you meet, one milestone that shows you're on the way to doing it. You get another contract, you get more money, things like that. So those things, don't really cost anything. Those are very important. Then as you go a little bit more ambitious, you can look at, I think there's a proposal coming out on something like IFCUS, which is Industrial Finance Corporation US, which is basically a development bank for some of these sectors. And I think that could go a long way in through a whole variety of tools, conventional subsidized lending to maybe more interesting kind of financial arrangements and hedging and so on, to make investment in these things, whether it's the defense industrial base or rare earth mineral processing or others, financially attractive. And then I think you do have to look at sort of how we connect or don't connect intellectual property and production, and whether it's through kind of patenting reform and other things, making it so it's at least people that seek to make money on technologies are more incentivized to actually invest in and undertake the production, whether in the U.S. or allied countries. So there's all those things, and of course, conventional trade and other stuff needs to be on the table. But I would say right now, I mean, especially just given your background, I think we need more people in the business community to start looking at these things seriously and thinking about them. There's actually a lot of political interest. There's a lot of kind of policy intellectual interest, but it's often the kind of business community that's not really interested in picking up the phone, not really willing to think through the long-term consequences or kind of take a risk. A lot of them are just like, I never want to deal with the government and things like that, which is understandable, but probably not going to work in this case.
Yeah, I hear that all the time. Like, basically, there's a profound disinterest or maybe even distaste in dealing with the government, but then they walk outside their multi-million-dollar home and there's homeless people all over the place. Well, that's a failure of leadership and civic engagement, and the people like at the highest end of our system, they have the ability to influence that and make a difference, but they choose to complain instead, which is disheartening.
Yeah. No, I mean, I spent a lot of time in Nigeria as well. There's a lot of billionaires in Nigeria, and there's also they have a thing called like the diesel importers cartel, which is there's a lot of oil in Nigeria. There's very little refining, so all the oil goes to Europe, comes back to Nigeria. There's also basically no electrical grid, and that's because there's a lot of people making a lot of money basically importing diesel fuel for generators. Most people in Nigeria, if you have electricity, you have your own generator and you're burning diesel fuel, and it costs $10,000 to have lights in your house every year. And people can make a lot of money on that. And then, you go to their houses and they're walled off compounds and you don't want to go outside and you have to build your own roads. And, you have to ask yourself, is that you can still have a pretty nice life as a billionaire in Nigeria, but I don't know that that's a future anyone would want.
Yeah, and that does, like, I think a lot of Americans don't understand that if you get this wealth inequality equation, like, to continue on this trajectory where the Gini coefficient is going to look like Nigeria, like that's what people in
Yep.
these countries do. Or Brazil's another one, right, where people live behind walled compounds and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, we published a great piece, one of our most popular, called the Brazilianization of the world, and I encourage people to read that.
Yeah. Regarding the sort of stock market incentive problem that we discussed earlier, are there policy solutions that could help with that?
Again, I think it's you're not necessarily going to do anything with the stock market itself, but things like IFCAS can make it more attractive for investors. And look, most growth companies, early stage companies, like they're not public companies. You don't really need to deal with public markets around that. But I do think, another thing we need to look at is around kind of taxation and tax avoidance. I don't. There was some fun data out recently about Pfizer, I think it was, showing like billions in profits outside the United States and losses inside the United States, so they don't have to pay taxes here. And the solution to that thus far has been kind of trying to negotiate some kind of global minimum corporate tax. But really, it's about taxing people where their profits are, and if you're profiting here and doing well here, we can always argue about what the tax rate is, but you should be paying taxes in the U.S. And I think removing some of those kind of disincentives against domestic investment, particularly for kind of really large companies, would probably be helpful as well.
Yeah. I had a gentleman on the podcast like 2 weeks ago who works for the like a bipartisan think tank. And we talked a lot about U.S. immigration policy, not border security, but legal immigration policy. And one of the ideas that I've been thinking about for years, and I'm not the only one, is this: why don't we just weaponize our immigration system and use it to brain drain the world and offer, all these kids who are studying at our schools, why don't we let them have a clear pathway to citizenship? Why don't we have H-1B visas at significantly higher numbers that are people are going to work for big tech companies and make hundreds of thousands of years? What's your take on that as policy?
Well, in theory, that's sort of what everyone wants. This kind of Canadian style point system where it's based on economic need, and Canada does it, or at least they used to do it kind of really well, where the kind of economic need was updated periodically. So, we don't have enough doctors, we're going to get more doctors. We have too many, we're going to get more engineers, whatever. That's the model, and then one can debate exactly what the numbers are, but I think that kind of point system model is the right way to go. The problem is there are lobbies on both sides that don't really want to have any solution to immigration. On the right, a lot of lobbies around agriculture and very low wage employment. They want to have illegals and kind of guest workers who work for very low wages but do not vote. And on the left, particularly the tech companies, they like H-1Bs, which in my opinion is a terrible, terrible visa, because you can work under an H-1B forever and never have any path to citizenship. You're bound to a specific employer, which means that if they fire you, you're out of the country. So you're never going to complain about anything. And if they pay you less, you're not going to care. Anyway, these kinds of employers, mainly on the Democratic side, I don't think they would really want like a very streamlined system that would allow a very highly skilled person who comes here and does well to like progress to normal citizenship quickly. They also have tended to, like things like keeping H-1Bs a lottery, stuff like that. They've tended to be very counterproductive there. So I think a lot of the immigration debate, unfortunately, is kind of dishonest. The Republicans talk tough. But when it comes down to it, when Trump had both houses of Congress and whatever, they don't really do anything because they actually want the illegals and the guest workers. And the Democrats talk about how open they are. But a more streamlined immigration system would probably not be, Silicon Valley probably not be thrilled about that if it meant that they would have to pay these people more. So unfortunately, I think, the immigration system is a mess, and the kind of the culture wars that go on around it probably obscure more than they reveal.
Yeah. Fascinating. What's your take on what the American policy should be at the border?
We published an article on that called "The Cause of the Latest Border Crisis and How to Fix It." I mean, I think if you're serious about legal immigration, you need to be absolutely serious about stopping illegal immigration. And the changes to the asylum laws and all that the Biden administration did, that has led to this crisis. The closing of the Remain in Mexico program has further added to it. And we've also done a number of things. It's called like Operation Controlled Flow, where basically treaties with Panama and others to allow migrants to move up through South and Central America to the U.S. border more easily. It makes absolutely zero sense. So, one proposal is actually we could do a much better job at the Panama-Colombia border, which is only 40 miles as opposed to 2,000, and be much easier to regulate. But in general, I think bring back Remain in Mexico. I think we cannot tolerate illegal immigration. We can be generous and make sure there's facilities and all of that, but we cannot allow illegal immigration to continue like this. That is my view, and I strongly recommend people check out that article, which includes 5 different points on the details of asylum law and all that.
Yeah, great. What's your take? A couple more policy questions. Getting to the end, but since you're here, I really
It's
want.
fine.
Okay, cool. We've been talking a lot on this podcast about housing policy because I come from a real estate background and have been dealing with it as a civic activist here, trying to fight against the NIMBYs. But what's your take on American housing policy and what it would take to get something that actually produced real housing for Americans?
You probably know better than me as an actual real estate investor. That's one area I've never really participated in. I mean, in general, I'm very sympathetic to the YIMBY movement. I think sometimes it can kind of be like presented as this magic bullet to every sort of problem. So, because I'm sympathetic, I'll offer a couple of caveats. One is that, one of the problems that we had, at least before work from home, was this very imbalanced kind of superstar city centric economy. And if all your growth is coming from 5 cities or whatever, I think you're going to have, building more housing is helpful, but you're not going to really solve the problem. And better diversifying growth around the country so that, more people are moving to Kansas or my home state of South Dakota or whatever. That is very important. The other thing that worries me about the YIMBY movement is it tends to be, a couple things. One is it tends to be kind of, I think the progressive YIMBYs in particular, sort of like, let's build a bunch of studio apartments, and it tends to ignore kind of family issues, and people don't necessarily want that. But the bigger issue that I worry about seeing it where I live now in kind of Massachusetts is there's this, let's just build the housing or kind of like remove obstacles to building housing, permitting reform, and things like that, all of which I agree with. But there doesn't seem to be much focus on kind of building the larger infrastructure to make this workable, particularly like transportation, roads. I mean, the commuter transit system in Massachusetts is awful. I mean, I live, like 20 miles from Boston. The express train takes 45 minutes. The normal train is like close to an hour. When we did this in the past as a country, we did build a lot more housing, but there was also just a real integrated effort to build better transportation. There were like new governance forms, like MTA Port Authority in New York, which is New York, New Jersey, all these kind of experiments to make this stuff work. I worry that there's maybe still a little bit too much neoliberalism there, and that we're sort of like, oh, if we just open up the market to build more housing, all these problems will be solved. I think we should do that, but I think we also need to think about, we don't have a European style transit system. So if you just build a bunch of apartment buildings, the roads are going to, traffic's going to be out of control. These things are not completely invented. You got to build the transit infrastructure to make that work. In Asia, if you go to Japan, they have these like incredible 3-decker highways and stuff like that. Why can't we do that here? So I just like to see a little more kind of holistic approach to some of the YIMBY stuff. But in general, yes, we should build more housing. I'm in favor of permitting reform, all that.
Yeah, those are great points, and I'm glad you brought those up. Like my issue with the YIMBY movement, the longer I got into it, I'm absolutely pro development, and I feel like we should be strategic, and I love the idea of thinking holistically. But my concern about it as a strategy is that the numbers are so crazy that even if the YIMBYs are wildly successful, there's still going to be inflationary pressure on housing. They're not going to build enough, and we've gotten to the point where it's essentially impossible for the market to solve this problem. And so we're back to this reality, which is, hey, we need the government and we need smart government policies, because there's a bunch of American families who simply cannot afford to buy a home or even rent a place. And we need to figure out how to help them do that through, maybe a larger Section 8 program, or, maybe a Singapore style subsidy program to help people own properties, which I think is kind of interesting. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, if you look historically, like, when this was really like there was a post World War II housing boom, which certainly involved market forces and also involved government. But to make this work, like the scale has to just be immense. It's not, one or two more buildings here or there might actually make prices rise. Like you have to really build a lot. And so I am not a housing policy expert. When I hear the word Section 8, it doesn't sound good to me. Historically, those experiments have not gone well. But I think that there has to be, a role for the government. I think it's unfortunate in this debate that it's sort of seen as kind of open up market forces, or, the government is purely like a source of restraint and zoning and problems. For this to work, the government can have a positive role. It's the same thing with kind of our manufacturing, whereas like, bringing in government means you're like anti-growth. And that unfortunately has been true for a lot of decades. But if we're going to turn this around, governments historically have played very important roles in promoting growth, and they need to do that again. And I don't think that should be absent from the discussion.
Yeah, agreed. Well, just two more questions for you, Julius. This has been a really fun conversation. I appreciate all the insight you shared. I like to ask my guests a couple kind of standard questions at the end. So the first one is, when you think about your work as sort of a public figure, public intellectual, editor of American Affairs, like what is the change that you're trying to bring into this world?
I actually see, I mean, I actually don't look at it as like a media organization. Our goal is not, to generate clicks for its own sake or advertising revenue or things like that. I actually see, we publish in American Affairs. It's sort of like applied, and like, because, to do something, you have to kind of write it down first. And that's really what it is. Less than like, let's find an article that people want to read, but like, let's find a problem, find the people working on that problem, and kind of have them lay out the blueprint for what they're doing. And then hopefully, that is helpful, and other people see what's going on and find it attractive. But it's fundamentally not a media organization. So, what we're trying to do is I do not come, I come from a finance and investing background. I think ideas are important, but I'm not like a college professor. Ideas are everything, or ideas for their own sake, or what it's about. I want to actually accomplish concrete policy changes. And so that's basically our approach. And when you see an article, I mean, we do big picture theoretical articles, but, at least half the magazine tends to be very concrete policy specific articles. And those are pieces that we hope to not just publish, but engage office holders on, engage agency staff on, and actually work toward getting something done.
Great. And last question is, for listeners that are concerned citizens and inspired by sort of this mission, what can they do to help?
I think, our website's americanaffairsjournal.org. Check it out. The most interesting pieces that we tend to write come from, practitioners, whether they're finance people and investors, tech people in Silicon Valley, pharma people, whatever. Sometimes they have to be published pseudonymously. That's okay. But if you're working on a problem, if you want to write something down and you're in this field and have real ideas, we'd love to do that. And then help us actually push policy. I think, again, we have to bridge this divide between people who, the people in politics who are in it for kind of the craziness and the entertainment, and the people that are, just lobbyists. Basically, we need to get serious people to just want to think a little bit bigger and advance a larger goal, but do it in a concrete and sort of pragmatic way. And that's what's absent. And if we can bring more of those voices to the table, whether through publishing, whether through events, whether through specific engagement, that's what we hope to do.
Yeah. I love that mission. And I sort of believe I'm optimistic because the more I do this, the more articles I publish, the more podcasts I release, and the feedback I'm getting, I'm convinced that there is this incredible demand out there for this type of conversation and this type of political engagement, which is to say, like, rational and pragmatic and not the entertainment, hyperbole, culture war stuff. Like, people want solutions to these big problems that are now kind of staring them in their face, and especially in the big city. So I'm optimistic and I appreciate the work that you do, Julius. Thank you for taking so much time, and I look forward to kind of following your thinking as it evolves and supporting American affairs. Thanks, man.
Thank you very much for having me.